So yesterday we kind of got started on talking about these, this responsive design, making our layouts adapt to different screen sizes. One of the questions to just review, make sure when you're setting up these variants, you're using the screen width and not the smallest screen width. Screen width is just what you would expect. It's the width of the screen at the current time versus smallest screen width. You're saying, okay, take whichever side of the screen is shorter and just use that, right? So if I go off of smallest screen width, the particular device will always have the same layout even if I turn it, but I do want the layout to change if I turn it, so that's where we want to use screen width instead of smallest screen width. Okay, so we started with dimensions yesterday, and in starting to scale those, I also mentioned that you can use integers in there to change the number of columns. Just kind of as a quick summary, usually in terms of working with the lists, really the only number that I change usually is just the number of columns. Because usually I can get it to a point where, okay, it looks good with one column on a phone, and then for larger devices I can just add more columns and I don't have to tweak any of the other numbers, because it's usually pretty good at, okay, 300 dp makes a good one column, so I'll tune it for that and then just add more columns. Versus say the detail screen, I might need to get more nitty-gritty in there and tune a lot of different numbers, because that may need to be more different from screen to screen to screen. Okay. One thing to be aware of, we are going to go through a few different approaches to how to make things responsive, which are going to work for different cases. So don't try to over-tune your stuff until we get to that endpoint. Recognize that there are some things that you may have to go back and tune, may have to go back and change some dimensions as we look at other ways to solve the problem. Okay. But the thing to be aware of, I wanted to mention dimensions first because it's kind of that underlying piece that actually ties in with any approach that you use. And it also is just a case of, it's usually the easiest tool to use, right? If I can just change this to be 200 pixels wide versus 400 pixels wide based on the screen width, that's usually the easiest way to solve the problem and doesn't require a lot of code. I think you already have seen that, right? Just changing dimensions is really, really super easy, okay? But it doesn't cover the whole space of things you're going to need to do, right? So there's some other things we need to talk about. So today, in here, there's kind of breaking this into 4 parts, because there's a few things I want to talk about. So I'm going to be talking about, we kind of talked about part 1 yesterday, I'm going to talk about part 2 and 3 today. And so I kind of mentioned and alluded and talked about screen densities yesterday, but we didn't really do anything with them yet. So one of the things that I want to kick off today is talking about that screen density and what does that mean as the main thing that we need to change. Okay, so in terms of the game library, we kind of talked through iteration 1. Today I'm going to talk about through iteration 2 and 3. So one of the things that we often tend to do anytime we're providing PNGs or bitmaps, raster images, we typically need to provide it in more than one format, right? Because remember, you have the screens on the left, lower density, screens on the right are higher density. One thing to mention is if you have an image that's too low resolution, generally you'll see that as being blurry. But if you have an image that is too high resolution, that will usually show up grainy. Okay. So if I take like a 512 image and scale it down to 64 by 64, that's where you're going to see it more grainy, or the pixels are going to be kind of more sharp and not look so good, going the other direction. Okay. The other direction is also just a matter of you're using more memory because you're using an image that's much larger than you need it to be. Okay. But what you see going up or going down is going to be a different effect. Okay. It's either going to be grainy or blurry depending on if you're scaling up or scaling down. Okay. And so a few things to kind of keep in mind. I mentioned in Android there's a few different classifications of DPI for different devices. You've got medium DPI, high DPI, extra high DPI, all the way to extra high DPI, because we keep adding X's and we keep getting more higher density screens, okay? You can also see the DPIs there listed under the different images that they have. So 160, 240, 320, 480, and 640. So they're roughly about 120 DPI apart from each other, okay? What you'll see there is that basically the higher density the screen is, the bigger of an image you need, okay? The bigger of the image you need in terms of at least the number of pixels that are on that image. Now, the thing that gets confusing is that I still want usually the icon to show up the same size regardless of the density of the screen. I still want the icon or the button to show up in a certain size regardless of how dense that screen is. But I need images that have more pixel data on different sizes, okay? So what that means is oftentimes when we're rendering images on Android, they're not rendered at, say, you know, the resolutions that you might be used to with the web world, right? In the web world, it used to be the standard that you said, hey, 72 DPI was good enough. Used to be the standard. It used to be what we would tell web developers. But if you look at the baseline, 160, that's baseline for Android. It's double that. So in general, images have to be pretty high resolution to start with, you know, because you're starting it at 160, going all the way up to 640. Do you know how much DPI the average printer needs? How much DPI do you usually need for a laser printer or an inkjet?
I don't know, but I know our printer settings can go up to 300 if you want to choose like best quality.
Yeah. So typical printer DPIs are about 200 to 300 DPI. So if you think about, you know, where does that land? That'd be high DPI to extra high DPI, right? So our screens, we're talking really high densities for some of the newer screens. Okay, we're talking something pretty hefty. So that's one of the things you have to be aware of, okay? And so what we need to do, and what we're trying to do, is we need to provide more than one different variation of those icons. But the question is, how do we do that? What icons do we pick? What resolutions do they need to be, right? So you have to do a little math to get there, right? We'll do a little bit of math to get to the point where you see, okay, I need a 64 by 64 image for this screen size, and a 48 by 48 for this screen size, and 32 or 32 for this side, right? So the question is how do we get to the conversion? Well, there's a few things we know in terms of, there's some relative constants in the Android world. So we can say that 160 DPI is, or 160 DP, because we're measuring our things in DP. Remember, those are density independent pixels, so we're trying to measure things that are independent of the pixel size or the screen density. So 160 dp is roughly 1 inch. Okay. Now I say roughly because that depends on your, it would only be exactly 1 inch if the DPI was measured accurately. Okay, so one of the weird things with the way that Android classifies these, you might see the little squiggly under those icons next to the different DPIs, okay? For a screen to be classified, say, as extra high DPI, it says 320, but it doesn't have to be exactly 320. It could be up or down or plus or minus a bit. So for instance, you might have a screen that's labeled as extra DPI and actually has a DPI of 300. Or even 400, right? It could, there's a pretty wide range of what that DPI actually represents. Everybody with me there? Okay. And in general, one of the things that they do when they're measuring these DPIs, they generally take the horizontal and the vertical DPIs and average those. Okay. Because it's one thing to mention in terms of DPI. DPI is not the same in both directions. Android will give you one number that represents and is an average of both directions, but both directions are different, okay? Well, why is that? So oftentimes when I'm talking about pixels, pixels are not squares. Contrary to what you might think if you've ever used Photoshop or Paint or anything. In terms of editing images, right, most of our image editors assume the pixels are square, but they really aren't. And depending on the screen, they may be in a bunch of different formats, but they're generally not square. So one common thing that you might see is a pixel might actually be made up of, say, a red piece, a green piece, and a blue piece. So a pixel actually oftentimes looks more like this, where they're just tiny, tiny little pixels that are not actually, they only render one color, your eye just blends it together. But a lot of screens are like this. You can also see this in a bunch of other arrangements. So sometimes, especially on plasma screens, they're more like tubes. So you'll see them like this, where you have 3 bars that are on top of each other. Okay, but all of that means that because the pixels are not square, again, the DPI is different depending on the direction. Does that make sense? So that's where I say roughly 1 inch. Okay, 160 DPI will not be the same size on every screen, hands down. If you go and measure it with a ruler, you're going to find the 160 DPI is quite a bit different between different screens. But it's roughly the same is what we're going for. Does that make sense? Is roughly the same. So if it's cases where you really, really care for it, then you have to get down and do some measurements and figure out those kind of things. But you can kind of assume that it's roughly 1 inch. Okay? The other thing we know is how we measure DPI. DPI in the Android world is measured as pixels per inch, right? So 160 DPI means 160 pixels per inch. Okay? So that means things like if I'm looking at a medium DPI screen, 1 inch, in 1 inch there's roughly 160 pixels. If I'm looking at an extra high DPI screen, in that same 1 inch, there's about 320 pixels. Okay? So if I'm trying to go from DP to pixels, the way I can do that conversion is I can take the number of DP that I have, so 50 DP, 100 DP, whatever, multiply that by the DPI over 160. Okay? So if you're medium, that'll just be a multiple of 1. If you're at all the way on the other end, that'll be a multiple of 4, right? So you can do a calculation there to figure out, okay, I have something on the screen that is so many DP, that means I need an image that is this size to render at roughly 1 pixel in the image is 1 pixel on the screen. Okay, so the problem is that we want to have the components generally be a fixed size in inches, but the actual images need to be rendered at the resolution of the screen. Okay, which means the image size actually has to vary. Okay, so if you run that calculation, I kind of threw this in Excel and output some numbers. So, taking a few common icon sizes that you might see, like, hey, I've got 16, 20, 25, 50, 100, 160, kind of run the numbers on that, okay? For 160 DP, it's kind of pretty easy, okay? It just turns out, hey, if it's that number of DP, then it's exactly that number of pixels. But you have to do a little bit more math when we're talking about other ones. So, for instance, I don't know if it was this one, I need to go back and check that one, but that one's come down to 0.5. So if I say here, you can kind of see the point is one of the things that happens is as the screen gets more dense, I need a bigger and bigger image, right? So if those numbers change based on two things, based on how big you're trying to render it, how big you're trying to render it in dp, as well as what the density of the screen is. So you've got kind of two variables in there, right? Now, remember where we've got most of our images from, okay? We've got images from a few different places. We've got vector icons that we've just added through Render Studio. We've got icons we've added from Flat Icon that have been created by other people. And we also have images such as screenshots and banners and such like that that have come from other sources, okay? So what we're focused on right now is those images that we pulled from Flat Icon, because they're PNG files. Those are the ones that we have to do special things with, okay? So what does that mean for us? Well, when we're going to download the image from Flat Icon, let me go just find one of them and take a look at what things look like. The good news is they do provide it in a bunch of different resolutions. Now, you can always pull down the 512 version and then just go into Photoshop and make your own different sizes, your own different resolutions if you need some that are not in that space. But saying that, hey, this is what we have available to us, right? And I'm not going to go into Photoshop. I need to know which one of those should I go pick for a particular screen density. Does that make sense? Right? So what our options are, we've got 512 pixels, 256 pixels, 128 pixels, 64, 32, 24, 16. But notice they're measured in pixels. The image you're starting with is measured in pixels, not measured in dp. Okay? I want to render it in Android on dp, but I'm getting the image in pixels. Okay? So I could try to run the numbers backwards. If I do a little bit of algebra on this formula, I can say that, okay, I can compute the dp from the pixels. I can say, okay, based on this size in pixels, that would be rendered as this many dp, and I could kind of run the numbers that way, right? So there it just becomes 160 over dpi instead of dpi over 160. And so I can see, hey, starting at maybe the highest resolution, right? So at that 512 image, which is the highest one they give you, okay, well that's roughly 512, 341, 256 to 171, 128. Okay, that can be rendered actually pretty large, right? But I'm not probably gonna render an image at 512 dp, right? So what would be a more normal size for us to have our icons? Something maybe closer to 50, right? So let's say I have an icon or a button, probably a floating action button, that needs to be 50 dp by 50 dp. What image should I download?
There isn't anything in 50, of course.
Yeah, of course there's nothing that actually matches directly to 50. So which ones should I download for my floating action button? Let's start with one density at a time, right? So start at medium density, right? Which one is going to look the best? Which size is going to look the best on medium density? What are the sizes next to it? So I want to get to 50 dp, so it's somewhere between 32 and 64, right? Those are the two closest ones, 32 and 64. So this one's going to be blurry, this one's going to be gray. Okay? This one's going to be blurry, that one's going to be gray. Both of these are noticeable effects, but I would say Another thing to mention on there, in terms of blurriness is not a problem you can solve. Because when you're talking about blurriness, you just don't have enough data, so the device can't fill in that data. It just has to stretch out pixel data that it has, right? If I start with this on the upper side, then based on the scaling algorithm that it uses, it may be more or less grainy. Okay, so if the device uses a good bilinear or trilinear scaling algorithm, then this is going to not look very grainy. It's going to look pretty smooth. If it uses what we call the nearest neighbor to scale it up and down, it's going to look more grainy. So that's a problem that you can solve just by having a device that uses a better algorithm, right? And so usually I would lean towards taking a higher resolution, a resolution that's too high over a resolution that's too low, okay? Because in general, the higher side is going to look a little bit better. So if I'm looking for 50 dp, I would take the 64 pixel one. Does that make sense? It's going to be a little bit more data than it needs to be, a little bit bigger file size, but it's going to be the one that looks best, and you're not going to see blurriness on it.
So you're saying the rendering algorithm, that's hardware dependent?
It's software and hardware dependent. It's both, right? So I think most of the devices that I've seen typically don't use nearest neighbor for scaling, but there's no guarantee.
Device to device.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that can't be there, right? It's basically a performance thing, right? So nearest neighbor is very fast in terms of a scaling algorithm, whereas bilinear is a little bit slower, but it gives you better results. So depending on how that device has been set up, it may or may not be using one or the other, okay? But if I can get something closer and it's not scaling it drastically, then that's better. You're going to see, if it is using nearest neighbor, it's going to be even more grainy the farther away it is. Because it's basically nearest neighbor just says, hey, let me just take the closest pixel, right, to where what should be. I'll just use that color, versus bilinear kind of averages all the colors, all the pixels that are going into that one pixel. So 64 is what I would pick here for medium DPI. What would you pick for high DPI? Right? If we're talking 50, I'm going to go here. And maybe let me fill that in. Where's my fill?
Starting with like 43 is pretty close, but maybe we don't want the blurriness, so
Right.
we'll do the next 5.
43 would be pretty close, but yeah, I usually want to overestimate rather than underestimate, especially since there's some variability in how the DPI is measured. Even if it was measured as, hey, it's roughly 240 DPI, it might not be exactly 240 DPI. So it turns out that I might need something a little bit bigger. So again, another reason to overestimate usually. So I might go down and pick that, right? If I go down to, I don't know, is that number? I don't think I got the same color for both of those. There. So, and if I follow that same pattern, right, I go down here and I say, well, extra DPI, it's a route. It's between these two, right, for 50 DPI. But again, I would overestimate. Go down again, I'd say, oh, okay, I need overestimate. And then again, down here. So typically it's going to look a little bit like that, where based on, keep pushing the wrong button, based on where you're sitting, is going to look kind of diagonal as far as options.
I was just gonna say, like, I mean, I would initially think that 43 dp might be close enough, but I guess it's just a good rule of thumb to always go on the higher end.
I would always go on the higher end. It's very, very, very close. But it's also very, generally speaking, it's very easy to see even a tiny amount of blurriness, and a tiny amount of graininess is usually not visible, especially if you've got the proper bilinear scaling happening. So one of the things to just kind of mention in that tone, one of the programs that's installed on Windows, something called Paint. Okay, Paint's been around for a long time. I would not recommend using it for image editing, because for the longest time, and maybe they fixed this finally, but for the longest time it used to do nearest neighbor when you scaled up and down. And so scaling images in Paint historically has produced really, really bad results because of using nearest neighbor, but Photoshop has not had that problem because they've always used a better algorithm. So, that's where I usually say, don't go do any image editing in Paint, because you're going to lose things like transparency, and the scaling just doesn't work very well. Cool. So that's where I would kind of land. Does that make sense? So how many? If I'm trying to render an icon at 50 dp, how many different versions of that icon do I need? 3, right? As we kind of look there, right? So for something that's 50 dp, I just need the 64, the 128, and the 256, right? And then I just specify, the good news is it works from smallest to largest, so I just need to specify it as medium DPI, high DPI, and extra high DPI. So I only really need to set up 3 variants, because these two are the same and these two are the same. Does that make sense? Anything you put in as applying to a certain DPI applies to that size and bigger. Okay? Let's say I want to take a smaller size and go for something like 20 dp, right? If I want to put in a 20 dp icon, I'm going to go again, start out looking for 20. I'm going to overestimate, right? So for 20, I might say, hey, let's use this 24, and then let me use a different color here, right? I go up, oh, okay, maybe 21 on this side, maybe 32 on this side. And so one thing you should see is definitely that it's more, there is a amount of error or looseness to those numbers. It's very rare that these numbers are anywhere near exact when we're trying to solve these sorts of problems. Okay, but this one, because it works through differently, this one I need 4 versus the other one I needed 3. Mainly just because, hey, the resolutions that they provide on flat icon, there's more at smaller resolutions. Right? They have lots of small icons and only a few larger ones. Make sense? So when we bring that in, that's where we've got to kind of start with, okay, what is the icon that we have, right? What is the icon that we're targeting? Which is a little bit easier based on what we did yesterday, because we moved all those values into dimens. And now I can say my console icons are 20 dp or 25 dp or whatever it may be, and go off of that and figure out which sizes I need. Okay. Another thing that this means, notice because these are different sizes, if you have, say, the consoles being rendered at 50 on the console chooser, which you probably do, versus on the list of games they're being rendered at 20, you're going to need to download and treat those as 2 separate icons, right? Because this would be the path, that would be the set of icons for the chooser, and this would be the set of icons for the list. Does that make sense to everybody? You're gonna have more than one, okay? So that means more than likely for, say, the consoles, you're probably gonna have 7 different sizes, right? 4 for the small size and 3 for the larger, okay? Now, if I crunch the number and do that for some of these, I kind of went through, crunching numbers, again, throwing some things through Excel and running through what are those numbers, okay? It kind of turns out like this. So if you've got, say, an icon that's 50, you need the 64, the 128, and the 256. Is really all I did is I took the table that was up here, that I will have this DPI. This is what it actually would be at a certain resolution. That would be the ideal size of it. And then just jumping up to the next step that's available. So 50, we would need 64, 128, 256. 20, we need those. 25, we need those. Does that make sense for everybody? So that's step 1, is I want to pull in some of those icons and different icon variations. So I want to work through that, and then we'll talk about tablet variations in a little bit. Okay? So I'm going to pull up my project in Android Studio. I'm going to kind of try to do this with one of the icons, and then I'll let you kind of work through it on your own icons. So I'm going to pull up the movie list. And I'm going to look under drawable, okay? So starting from the top, I've got this guy, right? So I've got this icon that I pulled down from Flat Icon, okay? One of the questions, actually, maybe let me do this with the floating action button. Maybe IC Compose. Yeah, let's do this one, okay? So here's an icon that I had pulled down originally, but I originally pulled it down as 512 by 512, right? Everybody see that? So this is a relatively large image. And just to check that, if you look in the top right corner, you'll see that it says 512 by 512, so it actually tell you the size of that image, okay? So I need to find this image, again, on Flat Icon. And so I think this was named something like Quill. And what did I call that? Well, what's who else? Yeah, there we go. So if I want to pull that one in, one of the things that I can see, I think if I go back to here, okay, so this is the icon I'd started with, is pretty high resolution, right? It might turn out, depending on what resolution I'm rendering at, I might actually want a slightly different icon that's maybe got less detail. So, for instance, if I were to look at this one's going to render better at a small size versus this one, because of the additional detail, is going to look better at a bigger size. So I might even want to vary what specific version of that icon I use based on the size of it that's being rendered. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start actually with this one right here, this quill pen. Okay, and so pulling this down, okay, in order for me to render this button, which this button is remember, a floating action button. Floating action buttons are typically 50 by 50. What size images do I need for 50 by 50? Okay, well, so for 50 by 50, that means I need a 64, a 128, and a 256, okay? So I'm gonna pull those down. So starting from the bottom, 64, I'm gonna hit free download. And when I save this, I want to actually give it a good name so that I can know which one is which, right? So I'm going to go ahead and right now save this down as Quill Pen 64 to remember what resolution it's at. I'm going to pull down the 128 and call that quill pen 128. And I'm also going to pull down the 256 version and call that quill pen 256, right? So I'm going to start by pulling down a few different variants that I need, a few different versions in different sizes. So that's step one. Okay? Everyone on pace with that? You understand what I'm doing? Okay. Now, I have named those. I put those names in there with the 64 and the 128, the 256. And that's just to keep things straight as I'm working with them. Here in a second, I am going to have to remove those numbers, just so we're clear, right? Because it turns out that when I'm done, all of these files have to have the same name. So they're all going to be called quillpen.png. If they're not, then they're not going to be different variants of each other. Okay? So if I go back to Android Studio, okay, one of the ways that I think I had done this previously is maybe to drag and drop it in. That may or may not be the most convenient way to do it, depending on kind of how you're setting things up. So let me just see how this works. So I'm going to go to my downloads folder. I'm going to find those 3 different variations that I just pulled down. And I'm going to start dragging them in. Okay. Now, I've got 256, I've got 128, and I've got 64. Okay. So starting from the bottom, starting from the lowest density, okay, so the 64 is what I'm going to put in as medium DPI. Okay. So medium DPI is the one for that. All right, so let's see what happens if I drag in the 64 into Drawable. All right, it's going to ask me this question. Okay. Now notice here that it's asking you what folder you want to drag it into. So everybody see that? Okay. Now at the end, you see it's saying on my screen, it's saying Drawable dash version 24. Version 24 saying only use this on version 24. But what I actually want to say is only use it on a certain DPI. So when I drag these in, I need to specify that for the path. This is drawable-m DPI. Okay, drawable-m DPI. I'm going to bring that in. Add. And so you'll notice it's right here, quillpen64.png, and you see little brackets at the end, says mDPI, right? So that says only use this icon on medium DPI. Okay, let me drag in the next version. So drag in 128. I think I have to have drawable. There it goes. Okay, so this one would be, according to my chart, this would be the extra high DPI. So I'm going to give it that name. So drawable X HDPI. Refactor, add. So I've got a version that's 128 by 128 and 64 by 64. And finally, I need to drag in the last one onto the drawable folder, and this one's going to go into extra high DPI. Is that right? Oh no, it's 3 X's. 3 X's. So extra high. So 3 X's, an H, DPI, factor, done. Okay, so now I've got 3 icons down here, and they've gone into different folders to specify what DPI they're used for, right? So medium DPI, extra high DPI, and extra high DPI. But notice they're not kind of looking like folders. There's that qualifier on there that says only use it for this, but it won't actually dynamically switch between those different icons because they're different names. Does everybody see that? Okay. Like when I created the domens the other day, you see how my domens are all in the same folder, right? So it's dynamically switching between the different domens XML file that's relevant for that screen width. Does that make sense? I want to have the same thing happen for my icons, right? So that means I need to rename these to all be the same name, okay? Now, previously I pulled this down as iccompose.png, so I'm going to name those that same name. I'm going to name these all IC_compose. So starting with 64, I'm going to hit F2, I'm going to rename this, if my right click will show up. Refactor, rename, and this is going to go to IC_compose. And as soon as I do that, you can see that it started to group those icons together. Okay. Next one, refactor, rename, IC_compose, refactor, rename, IC_compose. There we go. So what I have now is a bunch of different variations, okay? So it's going to say if there's not one specifically set for that screen resolution, I've kind of got my default here, right? Which maybe should be for a much larger screen size, but this is kind of where I have that. So I have that one, which is my default. I have medium DPI, which is 64 by 64. I have extra high DPI, which is 128 by 128. And I have 256, which is my extra high DPI. So that's how your icons, all of your PNG files that you have that are in the project, they should look this way. There should be more than one variant. Any questions about that? Do you understand how I got there? The kind of steps I got there to pull it down and to rename it, pull it in there? So what I want you to do is go through today all of your PNG icons that you have. Do this with them. Use my table and figure out, okay, this is a 20 dpi image, this is a 32 dpi image, or 50 dp, etc. Look at what the image size is and then set it up accordingly. Remember, for your console icons, you're going to need a small version as well as a large version, so you'll have two of those. So you should have like an Xbox small and an Xbox large. Okay? So go ahead and do that call it, let's see, halfway through. So call it at 2:30. I'll talk about how to do some alternate layouts and how that works. But work through this as much as you can today to get those icons.